Welcome to TandTeaching, the educational podcast you can listen to with a cup of tea. I'm Arthur Moore, and with me, as always, it's Mike Harrowell.
It's been good, thank you. I'm really excited about episode 2 of this mini-series on processing time. All day, Arthur.
I know, we had a lovely chat with Pippa, didn't we, all about processing times. And as we said, we're really going to be focusing on what that means for teachers in the classroom. And do you know what's lucky, Mike? Pippa has decided to come back for part 2 of this chat. Pippa, welcome back to TandTeaching.
Hello, nice to be here, and thank you for having me again.
Our absolute pleasure. As we said, taking so many notes. I was reading over my notes from episode 1 and we really spoke about what we want to know as teachers about processing time. And as I said, we're going to focus a bit more in on the classroom. So we ended episode 1, Pippa, talking about your absolute top tip for new teachers about process time, and you were talking about normalizing errors and creating that safe space. Can we go a bit more into that, and how would you go about creating that safe space so the rest of this can flourish?
I think it really goes back to social learning theory, where we learn by observing and we learn by seeing other people do things, and so by purposefully or not making mistakes as teachers and adults and parents and humans, I think that's a really lovely way to then go, oh, made a mistake, this is how I'm going to react to it. And then that enables, I could almost think it's as like a secure attachment to learning as opposed to a person. So this culture, I guess, of allowing space and time to get it wrong, get it right, have a discussion. It's more like a warm invitation to join the conversation as opposed to you tell me the answer now. So I think that's one of my takeaways. And I think the main one also is to just wait that extra little bit longer. Some of the research says that the average wait time when someone asks a question for the child to answer is between 0.8 seconds and 1.4 seconds, which is generally, I don't know, is it the resting heart rate, Mike? I'm not sure.
The way I've heard it described before is that we tend to give less processing time when we ask a question than is given to do a Formula 1 pit stop.
Yeah, it is true. And so genuinely feel just waiting that little bit longer and having the culture of the classroom allow that silence and that wait and that pace. I think that's a really lovely place to start.
I think, yeah, if we break that up, I think the embracing the science, because in order to create that culture of to have that thinking time, you need to make it okay for students to have that science. And silence in the classroom is horrible, Mike. I don't know if you had this when you started teaching. I hated a silent classroom. I was scared of it because it meant I wasn't teaching. I don't know if that's something you've experienced.
Yeah. New teachers generally are scared of silence. You ask a question and there's just this tumbleweed moment in your room, and you then feel like you need to jump in with the answer quickly, or you need to jump in with some prompts quickly. But actually, you have to learn to live with that silence and stand there and make that eye contact with people and look around the room and say, look, we're not moving on from this silence till someone gives it a go. I'm not expecting you to get it right, and it's okay to get it wrong, but we're going to try. And I think that's a really, really important aspect of making it a safe environment, a safe space.
Mike, do you say that to the students? Do you say, I'm going to give you time to think about this? Are you very clear about it, or is it just something that's implied for maybe working with them?
So I think you get it a lot when you use mini whiteboards, and I know you love a mini whiteboard, Arthur, is that you give them that, generally you give them more time, don't you, when they've got mini whiteboards? Even if you bring that together with think, pair, share. So buddy up with someone, discuss your thoughts, put your answers on a whiteboard, and then we're going to go, I don't know, 3, 2, 1, show me, or whatever. But then you get that as well. 80% of the boards go up. And I do then explicitly say, I am waiting for 100% of the boards to go up here. I want to see every single board up. And that's, again, learning to live with that silence. I'm forcing those students to try and process that information and give it a go. So yeah, I'm really, really explicit with that.
I say it in my practice. I ask tricky questions. And when children say to me, oh, I don't know, I go, that's okay. We can think about it. It's it's okay not to know. It's okay not to know immediately how to articulate it. Like we say with the processing, there's so many different things that lead into an answer. I don't care which part of it is the difficult part, but I know that giving more time will support any of those phases.
And I think there's little tricks you can do as a teacher to especially when you're trying to make a conscious decision to give your students thinking time. I was told, have a bottle of water on your desk and just ask a question and then walk, have a sip of water and come back. And that, it makes the thinking time longer, but without you just standing in the middle of a classroom, just, I expect you all to be thinking. Or I've seen teachers like literally just like go and make a note, like not even write anything, but tend to go and make a note, or they're going to walk around the classroom. They walk to the back of the classroom. Just these little cues. I've seen teachers kind of tap on themselves very clearly. I'm going to count to 3. You see it a lot in primary schools, don't you? I'm going to count to 3 here to kind of give those things. So I think there's things you can do very consciously as a teacher to be like, I am going to give you more thinking time. And then that's kind of what you were saying, Michael, just kind of like, that's more the culture of the classroom. And you kind of, with experience, you'll find what works for you. You'll find what works in your context, for your age group, the subject you're teaching in, because I imagine it's very different.
I think it's important that we recognise as teachers that we create the culture in our classrooms. But these things don't happen by mistake. They happen by design. And we have to, when we're planning these lessons, we have to plan where we think misconceptions are going to come up. We have to plan where we feel that students might struggle. And we talked about this in episode 1 briefly, didn't we, about adaptive teaching. It's about, as you get more experienced at this, as you teach that lesson more and more and more, you get to the point you understand this is a hard point for these students. So I'm going to have to give them that extra processing time at this stage. And I think that's really, really important for teachers, is that they almost over-plan so they understand when misconceptions are going to come up or students need extra thinking time.
What you're doing there is you're just reducing overload potential by giving yourself a framework. I think you just listed a lot of visual cues where tapping yourself or walking to the back of the room and to the front again, it makes things so much more predictable for the children that then they feel safe to go, I know I've got a little bit of time here because he hasn't even swallowed his water yet. So it's so many little things like that.
And routines, I think as a school, it should look the same in every classroom personally. So I think when you give the instruction to show whiteboards, it should be the same instruction in every single classroom in the school, the way you count down, the way you ask for it. Because can you imagine being in that classroom and Arthur asks a question about maths and he goes across and sips his water, and then he asks another question 2 minutes later about maths and he starts walking to the back of the room and tapping on himself. I'm thinking, what is going on here? If I know he's going to go to his water bottle every single time, it reduces that cognitive overload because I know that routine. Or if the teacher says, I'm going to give you 20 seconds to think about this in silence, and that's the same instruction, whether it's science or maths or English or drama, students, it takes away that overload and that kind of processing of other things so they can clear their brain and just think about what you're actually asking them to do.
So much so. And then you're really measuring and assessing exactly what you're teaching as opposed to how you're teaching it, because you're teaching it in a familiar framework, in a structure and a predictable routine, which then feeds into the safe and predictable environment where it's okay to do mistakes. And it all just comes together perfectly, doesn't it, Arthur?
Perfect.
No, you can tell when you give students the right thinking time because you see them kind of essentially completing the question. You don't see them rush or anything like that. I also like, Mike, when I'm kind of working with kind of educators and kind of helping them with this, is that I call it framing the question. So before you ask the question, you make it clear that they're going to have time to say this. So instead of asking your questions and then saying, I'm now going to give you 20 seconds, you say, in a moment, I'm going to ask you a question and give you 30 seconds to answer it. Here's my question. And what you've done there is you've said to the students, they can listen to the question without panicking how long they're going to have to respond to it. So they've already got that framework. Now I can focus in on the question. And I think just slightly changing your questioning, the semantics of your question, how you structure it, can make a really big difference. Framing, signposting, whatever you want to call it.
Totally agree. And that I actually think it makes a significant difference. And I think in an ideal world, with like everyone, all the classrooms would have the same language. But I think that's a really hard thing to achieve, especially with everyone teaching their own way and having their own rapport with different children and different children behaving different ways for different people. So I think if we can get it right for ourselves first and give us the confidence in how we do it, then I think it will just generally fall into.
Mike, can I ask a question there of you? Like you said, you'd want to see it kind of working across a school, and this is something you've got loads of experience of. Would you, if you were new to a school, say, kind of going in as a head of teaching and learning or something like that, would you come in with a structure of like, I want you to do this? Or would you walk around the school and say like, I've seen X, Y, Z doing this really well. This is something I want the whole department to do, then the whole school to do? Or you just say, my name's Mike Harrowell, and we always click when we're doing our thinking time? Probably the worst example.
Yeah. I think in any school, you've got to have common consistencies in a lesson. You've got to have a set of things that everyone does the same within a room to help students understand those routines and to reduce that cognitive overload. I think that's really, really important. I think if you're new to a school, one of the worst things you can do is go in on your first day and say, these are the common consistencies I expect you to have, without having any understanding of what the context of the school already is. So always look first, look for the common consistencies you can see, and then refine that list and build upon it into a framework, would be my advice. Because again, we're talking about student processing time here. We've got to think about adults processing time. And we see it all the time with trainee teachers, don't we? An answer's given and they're trying to think on the spot and think, well, where does that take me next in terms of my teaching? As opposed to an experienced teacher will know straight away. They won't need as much processing time to respond to a misconception or a question or something like that. So when we're teaching adults, we have to apply similar rules to when we're teaching students, because they're going to have processing time. They're going to have time to, like we said in episode 1, anchor that in their experience and then think about how they can apply it to their practice as well.
So much so. And I was just thinking, like, it's not a consistent thing either. So processing speed, for example, every human, their language skills deplete when they're stressed. So it's just the automatic response with the fight, flight, freeze thing. So if you've had not enough sleep, if you're stressed, if you've not eaten, like there's so many things that can make your processing speed lower that day as opposed to other days. So it's not just the general IQ of like a fixed thing. It mediates and moves, as you say, just like adults. Adults have bad days, kids have bad days.
Which is all, I always find this a little anomaly of education, is where we get teachers to teach all day and then we bring them together and try and do professional development after the end of that day, when their brains are frazzled, and then maybe they don't have the same processing time, or maybe they've got that cognitive overload because they've had a really stressful day.
I went to a school recently and their whole structure is quite different. So on Friday, they don't really do lessons, they do activities. It's not a special school, but 95% of the children there have EHCPs. And they just know on a Friday, you're not going to get any new learning done. So what can we do and what will be helpful? And they approach you like that. And it's so refreshing.
Recap Friday sounds great. I could be all over Recap Friday. But we have got schools who are going to 4-day weeks and trying it out. So who knows where this is going to go? I think one thing, what you mentioned, Mike, with thinking time, and kind of Pippa, you said this as well. So we often think about thinking time, it's literally just what the students are doing. But when the student gives me an answer, I've also got to process what they are saying. And this comes down to experience. I think if you can also demonstrate to the students, look, just give me a moment, especially if you're teaching, I don't know, A-level maths. I've always like, please give me a moment to go away and process this. But if you can demonstrate that as well, then that allows the discussion to flow. Sometimes, Mike, when we're doing like throwing questions around the room and bouncing them around, we're so keen to bounce it around that we don't give the students time to listen to the question before we're bouncing. So that's great. Now you jump. Now that's great. You jump. So we've given process time at the start of the question, but we don't keep giving it as the discussion develops.
Yeah, we did. We watched a fantastic session by Mr. Barton, didn't we? I think it was at the Inner Drive conference at Eton College. And he did a fantastic session about cold calling. And it was like, I'm not just going to do the classic, pose my question, pause, and then pounce on a student. But everyone's having that same processing time before I pick a student. He then showed us how to take that cold calling into a whole discussion where he then didn't tell them if they were right or wrong. And he said, okay, that's what you've given me. Shall we think about this now? And then went to another student, bounced it on. Right, what do you think about that response? And he showed, it was a really good example of how to keep everyone actually live processing. Because what we actually want students to be processing information the whole time and thinking about things. And I think it's really, really important that we do engage all of our learners in that process, as opposed to just pounce on one student and other students just going, well, I don't need to think about this anymore. I think that's a really, really important thing to do in your classroom.
Love it. How do you apply that to maths, Arthur? Do you ever tell them if they're right or wrong?
So sometimes it's self-evident whether it's right or wrong, but I think sometimes getting the student to say, like, why do you think Mike got the question right? Can you prove to me that Mike got the question right? And then someone can come back from that. Or, I heard that response. Why might you not disagree? And you can normally read your students' cues. You'll get a student who agrees with the answer and like, or nod along, and you can go like, why do you think that? Or you'll get students shaking their head. And I think, like, even though maths has a right or wrong answer, we can then have developed discussions about the process or kind of what's going about that. So I think bouncing questions around is one of the most powerful things you can do as a teacher, because you can bring students into the room. And what you can also do is, we talk about processing time being different for everyone. You know your students. The teachers listening to this know their students in their classroom, in their context, in their subject better than anyone. And you can design the way you're structuring your questions to different students when you're bouncing around. So if I've got a student who I know is really strong in this area, I can throw them a hard question, but then I can take that. I know a student's got process time. So I might say to that student, Shamir, I'm going to come to you in a moment. Like, I'm going to come to you, listen to this question. I'm straight away getting her in. Like, Ayushi, your next question, I'm coming to you. So you need to be switched on. And that's a really powerful thing to do as a teacher.
Saying that, and I agree with that, there is also a time to stop that and let the students just apply the knowledge and not have to be processing new information, because that's going to cause exhaustion and cognitive overload as well. If 60 minutes of these constant discussions and students are going to switch off, their brains are going to be frazzled within 5 minutes. So I think I'll take it back to the end to that planning, being really, really explicit in your planning of when you're going to have those conversations, when you're going to get students to process new information. And actually, when's the time for you to stand back? We talked about it in episode 1 about not being afraid of silence and saying, you've now processed this information. Now I want you to apply it to maybe one context, maybe multiple contexts. So it becomes kind of dynamic information that you can use in different scenarios. I think it's really important not to exhaust the students and understand when the time to step back and hand over to them is.
I love that. I totally agree. And what I think one thing I always come back to in psychology is the question, anything else? So when you've got questions and you've got answers, you can say anything else. Or you can say, because those discussions are modeling to children how to agree and disagree and how to do that nicely. And I think that's such a big learning curve to be able to say, I think that answer's wrong because, or I wonder if you put the digit wrong there or some. Just having the articulation to process and verbalize those discussions, I think, is a skill in itself. And I think that should be taught. And what you're doing is teaching that incidentally within both of your.
And we spoke earlier about kind of this normalization, this culture in our classroom. We spoke about mistakes. And like, I think like the classic, like we've all known a teacher, we have all done this as a teacher, Mike. And if you say you haven't done this, I'm sure you're lying. Where you make a mistake and like, I did that on purpose to make sure you're all paying attention. We've all done that. Which is often like the kids just expected, they know it's going to get it. But Pippa, I'm interested, like, how do we demonstrate, when we're demonstrating mistakes are okay, is it by making deliberate mistakes, or is it just kind of acknowledging when we or our students make a mistake? Is there kind of a right, and I don't know, maybe it's each to their own. I'm wondering how you do. Do you misspell your name and go, ha, 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 isn't that funny? I've normalized a mistake. Or do you just wait for a mistake to come up, which is what I do, because they come quite.
Yeah, like I make mistakes and I'm just not scared or defensive when I do. I'm just like, I spelt a kid's name wrong this morning. Like I just wrote Go Bob or whatever their name was. I wrote it on the board and I just spelled it wrong. And then they came in and they went, oh, that's not how you spell my name. And I was like, oh, sorry, let's change it. And they went, oh, it doesn't matter. And I was like, no, I'd like to spell it right. And I went through and changed it and got it right for them. So yeah, I think it's a bit down to personal preference. But I think if you're not making mistakes, I think it's a really good habit to get into, is acknowledging and making some mistakes, even if they're on purpose. I think it's such a skill and such a demonstration that we need to teach our kids.
Mike, do you have a tactic?
Oh, there's nothing worse in PE than demonstrating something and doing it wrong. Oh, it's the worst. The worst. Demonstrating that things like batting in rounders and you miss the ball. And you have to just say to the students, okay, that's a non-example. Done that wrong. Please tell me what I did wrong and get the students involved in it. But again, model making mistakes, just be lighthearted about it. If you keep missing, it gets really, really tragic and you do get the yips sometimes. But
Do you want to ask what's the worst mistake you've made in a physical educational lesson?
I don't know.
Have you fallen over doing a 100-meter sprint?
No, I've not fallen over, but early on in my teaching career, I didn't understand the need to circulate around the outside of a classroom or outside of a class. And I decided to walk through the middle of a football lesson and a student kicked a football and it hit me in the head and virtually knocked me out in front of the class. So it wasn't necessarily my mistake, but yeah, it would have been really easy to tell him off. But I actually had to say, look, I shouldn't have been walking through the middle of your passing drill there. That's my mistake. And I just stood at the side then just seeing stars for a bit.
My second week of teaching full time, I went to raise my voice at a kid, which I would never do now. Went to raise my voice at a kid, and my voice, having been teaching for 2 weeks, just went. So I just squeaked. Literally just went. The kids burst out laughing, and I had to stand there and be like, go for it. Like, go for it. And then from there, we kind of developed a bit of a relationship because I was like, I didn't like try and tell him off for laughing at me because it was kind of my flaw. And I think that's kind of what you're alluding to, Pip. It's like just creating a normalization of that culture.
Absolutely. Just having the space. And I think it's hard because, especially old school rules, I guess, having the children question and laugh with you might be seen as disrespectful and not done, and they need to be told off for that. And actually just having the space and the time to join them and say, yeah, that is quite funny, never mind. And how you move on. I think it's just so much teaching and learning happening. Brilliant.
So hopefully, listeners, there's lots of kind of little tips there for kind of new teachers, but also experienced teachers of what you can do to just kind of increase the processing time for your students. The things we really spoke about were kind of embracing that silence in order to allow more thinking time. And we came up with some strategies there. And we also spoke about kind of that creating that safe space to normalize mistakes so students can understand that kind of learning process. So hopefully you've taken loads away from that. I know me and Mike have kind of got all our notes. I can see Mike taking notes. We're going to come back next time in the third part of our chat with Pippa about processing time. And we're going to be talking a bit more kind of about neurodiverse students and kind of going to a bit more kind of specific techniques we can use with them, which I know, Pippa's your area, right? You're buzzing for this.
I do. I am looking forward to episode 3.
Well, we will be back for episode 3, listeners. Mike, what a pleasure as always. Thank you so much for spending your time with us.
Thank you, Arthur. Thank you, Pippa. And thank you to you, listener.